Can you briefly describe the three major worldviews that are currently clashing in American politics?
Sure. Well, one of the things that I'm trying to do with this work is steer some of the discourse that you find within the developmental community away from the focus on the psychological development of individuals, while certainly important and understandably attractive. When it comes to psychology, the state of it right now in history, it's a little bit like medieval medicine before the scientific method. There's a lot of misplaced confidence. There's a lot of sort of economically driven theorizing, which is questionable. And so the human mind and the consciousness that is associated with it is among the most complex things in the universe, and humanity's far from having an appreciation for the mind in the same way that we have an appreciation for the body, right? So scientific medicine has advanced significantly over the past couple of hundred years, but psychological insight is not advancing at the same pace, I would argue. And being able to talk about people's individual development according to stages is fraught. And I think, while not all wrong, I think that there's understandably plenty of objections to its relative inchoate status, and plenty of ways in which it's been abused by folks who don't appreciate the complexity and the subtlety of it. There's this kind of popularization, this popular version where people talk about other people in terms of being this worldview or that worldview. And while there's something to that, I'm not trying to say that's all wrong. The way I focus on this structure of emergence in human history is to look primarily at these stages or these phases of development as cultural structures, right? One of the things that integral philosophy brings is a very important understanding of that culture. There are systems and structures and movement, and there's a whole sort of ecosystem going on in the realm of culture that is not entirely within our heads, and it's not entirely physical or objective either, right? Where can we locate those systems? Where do those exist? If they're sort of floating in the air without any philosophical grounding as to how and why and where they exist, then our ability to appreciate them is significantly diminished. So one of the foundational moves that integral philosophy makes is to recognize this realm that's in between us, but that's neither physical nor subjective, neither objective nor subjective. The term of art is intersubjective. And the simple way to mean that is that when you and I have an agreement about something, like the meaning of a word, or a value, or some of the elements of culture, that those agreements have a kind of a freestanding existence. While they certainly depend on consciousness, for their existence, and they depend on physical things like the words coming out of our mouths and all the physical things we can point to in the world, you can't describe these cultural structures without remainder by just referring to the objective or the subjective. So the fact that we see there's these systems, and that they begin with agreements, but those agreements accumulate in the same way that cells accumulate into organisms. Human agreement about meaning and value accumulates into cultural structures, and the large-scale versions of these structures are these worldviews. So let me come at it from another angle. For thousands of years, the most developed places in the world were the great religious civilizations, right? Confucianism, Taoism, Shintoism, Buddhism, Hinduism, right? Judaism, and of course, Islam, Christianity, I could mention more, but the great religious civilizations, they all had art, they had literature, they had scripture, they had, hierarchies. Most of them had a feudal system of organization, government, with the king and the vassals. And so those kinds of civilization persisted, although changing a little bit, for thousands of years. But then in the mid 17th century, there began a kind of an emergence, right? In the same way that we see in the biological tree of life, new things emerge, right? Neurons emerge, right? Red blood cells emerge, the vertebrate emerges. These are amazing things that something more comes from something less. And beginning in what's now known as the Enlightenment, something more came from something less, in the sense that there was this new way of seeing the world. And this new kind of rational, objective, scientific, progress-oriented worldview emerged in Western Europe. And the emergence of that worldview, I mean, we could go on about the history of the Reformation. I mean, I'm trying to truncate the timeline here a little bit, but the Enlightenment is certainly a thing, right? It's a world historical fact that something emerged, and of course, that something brought the European countries that embraced that worldview tremendous power. They were still tied to the morality of a traditional kind of ethnocentric worldview. So even they had modernist consciousness, as we would call it modernism or modernity, and that's not a made up term by integralists, right? In academic discourse, the idea that there's traditionalism, traditional kind of worldviews, and then there's this worldview of modernity, or at least this culture of modernity, that's a well-established fact that's been talked about by writers and thinkers and academics all over the world, right? So it's not controversial or particularly new to say that modernity emerged, and where it has emerged, among other things, among things like scientific medicine, there was what's not very well appreciated, and that is what's been called the Great Enrichment. And that is in places where modernity became the dominant culture, and democracy and liberal values and science, kind of came to the fore in those places. The result that happens everywhere that occurs is that the average daily income of the average person goes from about $3 a day, in modern terms, $3 a day to about $150 a day. And so even though, there's gross income inequality, I mean, there are many critiques, legitimate critiques that can be landed against modernity. One of the things that not every American, I think, appreciates appropriately is that even those of us who are just middle class, we're significantly enriched by the culture that we live in, and so it's not just a matter of having, spiffy appliances. there's just this kind of, there's hundreds of material advantages which we enjoy, and of course, political and cultural advantages that make the emergence of modernity and the culture that is associated with it, both material culture and the political culture, a kind of emergence which people in the developing world seem to be inherently attracted to, right? So, that is, the youth of Iran definitely want freedom and technology, and they want to be in the developed world for good reason, right? Because it's an emergence in history which makes the human condition better. However, all of these emergences bring both new progress and new pathologies, right? So we can identify plenty of pathologies that existed in these religious civilizations, but those, despite the horror of slavery and oppression and the war and all the bad stuff that occurred in those thousands of years that the world was dominated by the religious civilizations, those civilizations never threatened to wipe out the biosphere like modernity, right? And they never had nuclear proliferation to the point where there could be nuclear winter if the United States goes to war with the Soviet Union, kind of Russia. Modernity brought new gifts, but it also brought new disasters, new threats that humanity had never encountered before. And so that naturally made modernity inherently unsatisfactory and to a lot of sensitive, especially artists and intellectuals. And even back in the 19th century, what historians call the revolt of the artists and intellectuals, that modernity, after it sort of started to gain ground and make its way in the developed world, that many began to take a dim view of it, right, for legitimate reasons. And these critics of modernity, among the things that were manifesting in their critique was that, at least the religious civilizations had a clear sense of transcendence, a clear sense of what the meaning of life was, and what was more important than self-interest, right? And they defined it in various ways, but that was also, the sense of transcendence or spiritual growth or the good, the true, and the beautiful, however we want to frame that. That sense of transcendence was fundamental. It was the glue that held those civilizations together. And so by breaking out of that, right, in the Enlightenment, some of it was smooth, some of it was violent and radical. But by pushing off against and rejecting this earlier level of civilization, modernity also emphasized the individual. The liberal sovereignty of the individual is one of its strengths. But the same strengths that these worldviews have also become the source of their pathologies. So in the same way that modernity emphasized individual liberation and upward mobility and all the things that it stands for in terms of its value set, it really lacked a sense of transcendence, right? People would become rich and get all the status and material that they want, and they would look around and say, "Is this all there is? There's got to be more meaning, to life than simply modernity's view of the good life." And so all this evolutionary discontent was bubbling up for decades, and then, of course, in the 60s, it emerges as a kind of the artists' and intellectuals' discontent becomes democratized, in the hippie movement, and the middle class youth of America embrace this alternative, this counterculture, and that emerged powerfully in the 60s, and it's continued. What we now call the progressive postmodern worldview, or progressivism for short, as the media is now starting to try to identify it. The understanding that this is a worldview. The worldview concept is so important because if we're going to ask what culture is, as I argue in developmental politics, worldviews are the basic units of culture. And before there were just religions, right? But when modernity emerges, we have to ask, well, what is that? Because if you just try to take piecemeal pieces of it, if you just have the technology without the liberal values, you get pseudo-modernity, which is extremely dangerous, like Nazi Germany or World War II Japan, right? That they have the technology, but they still have this kind of ethnocentric totalitarian political structure. So modernity is something you can pick and choose from. It's a worldview that has a coherent set of values, and it's by entering into, by participating in the structures of agreement which make up this worldview, that people get the kind of consciousness that leads to new power, new ability, new economic opportunity that makes things better, at least materially, in these developed countries. So when we understand that modernity is a worldview, then we can see, oh, well, these other religious civilizations, they can be understood as worldviews too, right? Even though there's multiple traditionalisms, because there's multiple religions, there's a singular modernity, and so I argue, because unlike religions, which are based on the scripture, which differ, the truth for modernity is based on science, which is universal, right? So you don't have Japanese science and Swedish science, right? You have modern science. And that's why modernity is kind of unified, at least at a level of broad scale agreement. Once we have these two worldviews in place, we can see progressivism as its own worldview, right? A distinct worldview, certainly not as big, certainly not as old, but it's an emergence which can be compared to the emergence of modernity and the Enlightenment, or the emergence of the ancient religious civilizations in the axial age. So now we have the three worldviews online, and we can begin to see why we have a culture war,